Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we delve into a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is January 23rd. On this day in 1978, Teresa Wallen was brutally murdered in her Sacramento, California home. Her tragic death was part of a horrific killing spree carried out by Richard Chase, a man who would become infamously known as the Vampire of Sacramento. Today, we'll dive into Teresa's story, the unimaginable events of that day, and the investigation that ultimately brought Chase to justice. Let's get started. In 1978, Teresa Wallen was just 22 years old. She was a bright and caring woman with so much to look forward to. She lived in Sacramento with her husband David and was 3 months pregnant with their first child. Teresa loved animals and was known for her kind, compassionate nature. Friends and family described her as someone who embraced the small joys of life and poured her heart into her relationships. On January 23rd, Teresa was home alone while David was at work. What should have been just an ordinary day turned into an unimaginable tragedy. Her life and the life of her unborn child were taken so brutally that it affected not only the lives of her loved ones, but also the investigators and everyone else who worked on her case. That day, Richard Chase entered Teresa's home through an unlocked door. For Chase, this wasn't just about convenience, it was part of his delusions. He believed that a locked door meant that he wasn't welcome, but an unlocked door was an invitation. Teresa's door was unlocked that day because she had just taken out the trash. Once inside her home, Chase shot Teresa 3 times with a .22 caliber handgun. But what he did next was beyond comprehension. In fact, the scene was so grotesque that even experienced detectives struggled to understand what had happened. Without getting into too many details, Chase mutilated Teresa's body, removed several organs, and committed necrophilic acts. He even put her blood in a yogurt container and drank it. I only mention that last part because Richard Chase was convinced that consuming blood was the only way to save his deteriorating body. Chase's delusions were fueled by untreated schizophrenia. They led him to believe that his blood was turning to powder and his organs were failing. In his distorted reality, drinking blood was the only way he could survive. To understand how someone can commit such atrocities, we have to talk a little bit about Richard Chase's background. Born in Sacramento in 1950, his childhood was marked by instability and neglect. From an early age, he displayed troubling behaviors associated with the McDonald triad, which is a pattern linked to future violent offenders, especially serial killers. And this triad includes bedwetting, animal cruelty, and fire setting. As Chase grew older, his mental health deteriorated further, and he was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Chase soon became consumed by delusions that his body was falling apart. He began to self-medicate by eating raw animal organs and drinking blood, convinced that this would restore him. By late 1977, these delusions escalated. His first known victim was Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old man whom he shot in a drive-by attack. This random act of violence marked the beginning of Chase's brief but horrifying killing spree. The crime scene at Teresa Wallen's home was a nightmare for investigators. Inside were blood-stained walls, her mutilated body, and a yogurt container filled with blood. Chase even left behind the butcher knife that he used. All of this painted a horrifying picture of Richard Chase's crimes. Fortunately, detectives were able to collect crucial forensic evidence, including blood samples, bullet casings, and even fingerprints. This helped establish a link to Chase when more murders occurred just days later. Detectives noticed a chilling pattern in Chase's behavior. His crimes involved consuming his victim's blood and leaving behind evidence of his delusions. This MO connected Teresa's murder to earlier cases, including Ambrose Griffin's, and prepared authorities for the horrors that were still to come. Chase's crime spree reached its peak just days later. On January 27th, he killed Evelyn Miroth, her 6-year-old son Jason, and 22-month-old nephew David Ferreira, and her friend Dan Meredith. He began by shooting Meredith in the driveway and stealing his keys. Once inside the home, he murdered Evelyn and Jason in ways that were eerily similar to Teresa Wallen's case, consuming their blood and mutilating their bodies. He abducted baby David, whose dismembered remains were later found. The sheer brutality of these crimes shocked Sacramento and heightened the urgency of the investigation. Evidence from the crime scene, including shoe prints and bullet casings, directly linked Chase to the killings and helped solidify their case against him. Witness descriptions of a disheveled man in the area pointed police toward Richard Chase, whose history of mental illness and violence made him a key suspect. A search warrant for Chase's apartment revealed a scene that confirmed their worst fears. Walls smeared with blood, blood-soaked clothes, and human remains in his refrigerator. On January 28, 1978, just one day after the Miroth murders, police arrested Chase. The arrest marked the end of a terrifying spree, but the loved ones of his victims were left grappling with the horrors that he had inflicted. Richard Chase's trial began in January 1979. The prosecution laid out an overwhelming case, with forensics and witness testimony painting a harrowing picture of his crimes. Evidence from his apartment, including human remains, left no doubt about his guilt. Chase's bizarre courtroom behavior, including ramblings about his delusions, underscored the severity of his mental illness. His defense argued that he was legally insane and pointed to his schizophrenia and delusions as proof of this. However, the prosecution countered that despite his mental illness, Chase still knew that his actions were wrong, and they pointed as his attempts to evade capture as proof. After just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. For the victims' families, the verdict proved some measure of closure, though it could, of course, never undo the devastation that Richard Chase has caused. Richard Chase's crimes became a case study for criminal psychologists, particularly in understanding violent behavior driven by mental illness. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit used his case to refine profiling techniques, emphasizing the dangers of untreated mental illness paired with violent tendencies. The tragedy also highlighted failures in mental health care. Despite multiple interventions, Chase was released into the community with devastating consequences. His story remains a reminder of the need for improved mental health support and intervention strategies. David Wallin, Teresa's grieving husband, didn't talk much to the press, though he later shared in a statement, quote, "Teresa was my whole world. Losing her in such a horrific way is a pain I'll carry for the rest of my life." End quote. Richard Chase's death sentence was never carried out. In 1980, he died by suicide in his prison cell, leaving behind a legacy of horror and unanswered questions about how such tragedies can be prevented. His crimes remain among the most disturbing in Sacramento's history. Today, we remember Teresa Wallen and all of the victims of Richard Chase. Their stories remind us of the importance of addressing mental health and the tragic cost of failing to do so. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Stay safe, and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!